Ah, son, come closer and listen carefully, because the story I'm about to tell you isn't just about a battle, it's about the rebirth of a nation. Once upon a time, there was a kingdom hidden behind the mist, with green hills and valleys rising up, England. But by the year 1066, these lands were standing on the brink of a great storm. The English had established a system of order with their own lords and kings for many years. But fate sometimes brings huge changes that can shake even the most stable thrones. And that year, a man from Normandy, William, was preparing to carve his destiny into England's fate with iron and fire. The storm that would erupt at Hastings wasn't just a battle, it was the beginning of an era that would change England from top to bottom. But, as with every great story, you can't understand the end without knowing the beginning. So come, let's first take a look at what England was like right before the Norman Conquest. A country's fate is often shaped not just on the battlefield but in the halls of power, through quiet agreements and in the hearts of ambitious men. In 166, the blood spilled at Hastings had actually started flowing long before swords clashed. It wasn't just a battle, but the end result of a royal struggle that had been simmering for years. So, how did England end up on the path to Norman rule? To understand that, we need to step back a little. Back then, England was under the rule of the Anglo-Saxons. But it wasn't exactly the unified kingdom people might think it was. England was actually made up of different regions, each with powerful noble families controlling their own land. One of the strongest of these families was the Wessex dynasty, which had long been the dominant power in the country. But England's lands weren't just in the hands of the Anglo-Saxons. The Vikings, who had come from Denmark, also claimed parts of England and had once ruled over them. So this was a complicated situation, not just an internal matter, but one involving outside forces too. Now, in the midst of all this, King Edward was on the throne. We know him as Edward the Confessor. He was a religious, introverted man. He was loved by the people, but he didn't have the harsh temperament needed to be a strong ruler. In his later years, he left no clear heir to the throne, which was a sign of impending disaster. Ah, son, one of the most dangerous moments in history is when a king dies without naming a successor. It's the beginning of chaos. When Edward died on January 5, 1066, England's future was uncertain. That day, as his funeral was held at Westminster Abbey, the people only had one question on their minds. Who would be the next king? Three main contenders were vying for the throne. Harold Godwinson, the Earl of Wessex, one of the most powerful Anglo-Saxon nobles. Immediately after Edward's death, the Witan Nagamot, the Anglo-Saxon council, declared him king. But this wasn't an easy decision to accept. William, Duke of Normandy, here's the source of the storm. William claimed that Edward had promised him the throne. He also said Harold had sworn an oath of loyalty to him, but had broken that oath. Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway, a strong warrior of Viking blood, he claimed that part of England's throne actually belonged to Denmark and Norway. These three men all wanted to be England's ruler, and so this great battle for the throne brought England to the brink of war. Before the Normans set out, the Anglo-Saxons and Vikings had to clash first. But don't rush, son, because the story is just getting started. Ah, my child. There are moments in history when a single day, an hour, or even a single moment can change the fate of a nation forever. The Battle of Hastings was one of those moments. On the morning of October 14, 1066, an army set out to crush another on the hills of England. On one side, there was the Anglo-Saxon King Harold Godwinson. On the other side, Duke William of Normandy. This battle wasn't just about two men or two armies. It was a confrontation between the old and the new, a clash between Anglo-Saxon traditions and the Norman order. Harold and his men had just defeated the Norwegians in the Battle of Stamford Bridge to the north. But the price of that victory had been steep. They were tired. Still, Harold wasn't about to let the enemy advance onto his land. He quickly moved south from London to face William's forces and set up on Senlac Hill near Hastings. So what were the armies like? Anglo-Saxon army, Harold's army, was mostly made up of infantry. Its strongest component was the Huscarls, heavily armored warriors. These men were professional soldiers who had trained for years and carried long Dane axes. Alongside them was the Fjord, the Anglo-Saxon militia. However, Harold's army had no archers, and his cavalry was almost non-existent. Norman army, William's forces were more complex. His army included infantry, archers, and cavalry. The Norman knights, with their armored horses and quick tactics, provided a significant advantage. Also, William's archers would become one of the key factors in determining the outcome of the battle. Harold planned to hold a defensive position on the hill, hoping to repel William's attacks. The Anglo-Saxon warriors used a shield wall tactic to absorb the enemy's attacks and counterattack. William, on the other hand, intended to use his cavalry and archers to force the Anglo-Saxons to break that line. And so the battle began. In the morning, Norman archers started showering the Anglo-Saxon lines with arrows. But Harold's men held their shield wall tightly, and the arrows didn't have much of an effect. William then sent in his infantry and cavalry for a direct assault. The Norman soldiers had to fight their way up the slope of the hill, and the Anglo-Saxons repelled them with great discipline. But then fate intervened. In the middle of the battle, the Anglo-Saxons spotted a gap in the Norman lines and thought William's forces were retreating. A group of Anglo-Saxon soldiers broke rank and left the hill to pursue the retreating enemy. But that was part of William's plan. The Norman army pretended to retreat several times, using feigned withdrawals. The Anglo-Saxon soldiers who followed them down the hill were surrounded by cavalry and slaughtered. Slowly, Harold's once impenetrable shield wall began to crack. And then came the moment that decided the fate of the battle. As evening approached, William once again ordered his archers to fire. But this time he told them to launch their arrows higher, arcing them down onto the shield wall. The arrows that rained down onto the Anglo-Saxon warriors' shields were deadly, and according to the stories, one of those arrows struck Harold directly in the eye. Ah, my child, the death of a king is like the fall of a nation. When Harold fell, the men around him were slaughtered one by one. The Anglo-Saxon army began to collapse. Some soldiers fled, while others fought to the bitter end and died. By sunset, Norman flags were waving over the hills of Hastings. William declared victory as the new ruler of England. The Anglo-Saxon era had ended. A new age was beginning. But remember, my child, winning a battle doesn't mean you've conquered a kingdom. William's real struggle was just beginning. Ah, my son, victory on the battlefield is often just the beginning. The real challenge is turning that victory into lasting power. And for the Normans, that's exactly what they had to do. After the Battle of Hastings, William's work wasn't done. Yes, Harold was dead and his army was scattered, but that didn't mean England was fully conquered. There were still pockets of resistance in Anglo-Saxon lands, and the Golden Towers of London were still waiting for a Norman king to take the throne. Now let's remember how the rest of this great conquest unfolded. It was October of 1066. The victory at Hastings was won, and William's army had claimed the field, but the Anglo-Saxons weren't ready to submit just yet. In London and other major cities across England, Harold's supporters were still strong. The English, after Harold's death, tried to elect a new king to resist the Normans. Right after Harold's death, the Witan, the Royal Council of Anglo-Saxon nobles, didn't want the throne to remain vacant, so they declared Harold's young nephew, Edgar Aetheling, as the new king. However, Edgar's biggest problem was that he was very young and inexperienced. He didn't have a solid army, and he didn't have widespread popular support. William couldn't safely declare himself King of England without dealing with the greatest threats in the country first. So, instead of marching straight to London, he decided to conquer the surrounding regions, and put a siege around the capital. William could have marched directly north to London after his victory at Hastings, but that would have been very risky. The Anglo-Saxons still controlled big fortresses and garrisons in various parts of England. If William had attacked London and failed, it could have seriously weakened both his morale and his military strength. That's why the Normans started by taking the cities in the south and west. After leaving Hastings, William targeted Dover Castle. This was one of the most important fortifications on England's southern coast. However, the people of Dover had seen William's power and chose to surrender rather than resist. After Dover, William took Canterbury as well. By controlling this important religious center of England, William aimed to win the support of the Catholic Church. If the Church became a part of the Norman Conquest, breaking the resistance of the English people would be much easier. London wasn't a city that could be easily attacked. It was England's largest and wealthiest city, with strong walls and a good resistance force made up of Anglo-Saxon nobles. Instead of attacking directly, William decided to strangle the city economically and militarily. So the Norman army began taking the cities around London one by one. Winchester, once one of England's capitals, it fell under William's control. Wellingford and Berkhamsted, the outer defenses of London, began to crumble. Food and supplies cut off from London. The Normans took control of the Thames River and restricted the flow of food and supplies into the city. The people of London were growing weaker. The Anglo-Saxon lords, facing Norman cavalry and mercenaries, began to lose their morale. A decision had to be made. When the nobles of London realized the strength of the Norman army, they understood the war was lost. Edgar Atholing's chances of staying on the throne were slim. The Witten members sat down to negotiate with William and eventually decided to surrender the city. And then, my son, the day that changed the fate of England came. On Christmas Day, a grand ceremony was held at Westminster Abbey in London. William was crowned as the official ruler of England. However, according to the stories, during the coronation, the cheers of the crowd were misunderstood by the Norman soldiers. The shouting and joy in the church were mistaken for a rebellion, and the soldiers, in a panic, set fire to parts of the city. So, as William was crowned King of England, parts of London were burning. And with that, the Norman conquest was complete in 1066. But remember, my son, conquering a kingdom is much easier than ruling it. William had claimed the throne, but he still had a lot of work ahead to make the English people accept Norman rule. The new kingdom would be shaped by new laws, new castles, and new lords. And the Norman order would change everything the Anglo-Saxons had known. But that, my son, is a story for another time. Ah, my son, we've reached another turning point in history. The Normans' victory was now undeniable. William had defeated Harold at Hastings and had gradually taken control of England. But a ruler's power is not measured solely by the swords of his army. True domination comes when the people and nobles accept him as their king. Now we are about to witness the moment when William stepped beyond being just a conqueror and became the true ruler of England. This conquest was sealed with the coronation, but, my son, not everything went according to plan. It was December 25th, 1066. On Christmas Day, within the high stone walls of Westminster Abbey in the heart of London, England's new ruler was preparing to ascend the throne. This place had been the site where Anglo-Saxon kings had been crowned for years, and William didn't want to break with this tradition to legitimize his rule. However, there was great unrest in the city. The Anglo-Saxon people could not stomach the idea of a foreign king ascending the throne. Even though William had captured London through siege, he was still seen as an invader in the eyes of the people. Norman soldiers patrolled the streets, while English lords whispered words filled with fear and anger. In the early morning, the doors of Westminster Abbey opened. The crowd that entered was silent as they listened to the hymns of the service echoing between the stone walls. William, dressed in a dark robe, had removed his armor for the ceremony. He wore a golden crown adorned in the Norman tradition. With him were the highest-ranking nobles and soldiers he had brought from Normandy. The Anglo-Saxon nobles were also invited to the ceremony, but their faces showed nothing but reluctance and unease. Some of them knew they had no choice but to accept William's power, yet they didn't want him to impose Norman laws upon them. When the most critical moment of the ceremony arrived, Bishop Aldred and the Archbishop of Normandy placed the crown upon William's head. For the Anglo-Saxon people, this moment marked the end of 1,000 years of Anglo-Saxon rule. Before the church, with the Holy Scriptures recited, William was anointed as King of England. And right then a loud noise erupted inside Westminster Abbey. The Anglo-Saxon and Norman nobles inside, hearing the bishop declare William as king, shouted their approval loudly. However, these shouts were misunderstood by the Norman guards outside. Norman soldiers, hearing the sudden sounds from the church, mistook it for a rebellion or an attack. In an instant, they drew their swords and began moving through the streets of the city in a panic. Some attacked the homes of the people, while others started fires in the city. As William was crowned inside the church, some parts of London were already engulfed in flames. Norman soldiers, seeing the Anglo-Saxon people as a threat, looted many shops and homes. Those inside the church couldn't fully understand what was happening outside, but when the smell of smoke began seeping in, fear filled the hearts of everyone. Despite all the chaos, William maintained the calm expected of him. At the end of the ceremony, he walked out of the church as the new King of England and ordered his soldiers to calm the city. But it was too late. For the people of London, William would now be remembered not only as a conqueror, but also as a tyrant. With his coronation, the nobles of England realized a truth. It was too late to resist. Harold was dead, Hagar Atheling couldn't defend the throne, and London had surrendered. Some Anglo-Saxon nobles chose to collaborate with the Normans. Those who swore loyalty to William were able to keep their lands and titles. However, most Anglo-Saxon nobles were unhappy about bowing to a Norman king instead of one from their own family. The people, on the other hand, continued to see the Normans as oppressive invaders. The harsh rule of the Norman soldiers, the rise in taxes on the people, and the replacement of traditional Anglo-Saxon laws with Norman laws sparked great hatred towards William. With his coronation, Norman rule was officially established, but that didn't mean a period of peace. In the years that followed, Anglo-Saxon uprisings would flare up all across England. The Normans may have conquered these lands, but establishing lasting control would be much more difficult. And so, my son, the Norman era in England began. William had been crowned, but he still had many issues to resolve. The people were not loyal to him, the nobles resisted Norman laws, and uprisings threatened every corner of the country. The great conquest was complete, but the real struggle was just beginning. Ah, my son, for a conqueror, the greatest battle is not won with swords alone. True dominion is achieved by conquering hearts and minds. Yet, in Anglo-Saxon lands, this would not be so simple. William, crowned and proclaimed the new King of England, had not yet earned the acceptance of the people. The Anglo-Saxons would resist Norman rule and rise in rebellion to reclaim their independence. But William was determined to rule the lands he had conquered with a firm hand. And so we step into the bloody history of uprisings and brutal Norman repression. The first major rebellion began in 1068 in the regions of Mercia and Northumbria. The leaders of this revolt were Edwin, the Earl of Mercia, and Morcar, the Earl of Northumbria. These two brothers were the last representatives of Anglo-Saxon nobility, and although they had been forced to submit to William, they harbored deep hatred for the Normans. To secure their loyalty, William had promised Edwin marriage to one of his daughters, but this promise was never fulfilled. Edwin and Morcar soon realized they had lost William's trust and would no longer follow his orders. In the eyes of the Anglo-Saxon people, they could now become symbols of resistance against the Norman tyranny. In 1068, Edwin and Morcar raised the banner of rebellion, arming the people of Mercia and Northumbria. Many Anglo-Saxon lords from York and surrounding areas joined them. This was a serious threat to William. Losing control of the northern territories would shake the very foundations of Norman rule. But William, as a ruler, was not willing to show weakness. He assembled a large Norman army and marched north. When the Anglo-Saxon resistance faced the might of the Norman forces, they were forced to retreat before the superior armor and battle formations of the Normans. Edwin and Morcar tried to flee when they saw the rebellion was failing, but they were captured. William would show no mercy to those who rose against him. Edwin and Morcar's forces were crushed, their men scattered, and their lands seized. Edwin was soon killed while trying to escape, and Morcar was captured by the Normans, spending the rest of his life as a prisoner. But, my son, the Anglo-Saxon resistance would not end here. Because no matter how powerful the Normans were, the English people were not ready to submit, and the fire of rebellion would be stoked by a man named Hereward the Wake. Hereward the Wake, his name was surrounded by legends. Some said he was a noble warrior, others that he was a bandit, but one thing was clear to all. He was the man who organized the greatest resistance against the Normans. Hereward was said to have been born in Lincolnshire and exiled at a young age. However, when William's Normans conquered England, he returned. Upon his return, he found that his family had been killed and their property seized by the Normans. At that moment, his war had begun. Hereward gathered a small army of Anglo-Saxon remnants and began a guerrilla war against the Normans. His refuge was the island of Ely, surrounded by natural marshes. This island was like an impenetrable fortress for the Norman cavalry. The Norman armies were large and powerful, but the marshes and narrow paths restricted their maneuverability. Hereward and his men carried out swift raids on Norman garrisons, catching them off guard and attacking supply convoys, starving William's soldiers. This war was one that could be won not through direct battle, but through intelligence and strategy. When William learned that Hereward had established a center of rebellion in Ely, he gathered a large army and laid siege to the island. The Normans tried to cross the marshes by building wooden causeways and floating bridges, but Hereward and his men repeatedly thwarted their progress by setting the bridges on fire. Hereward's resistance in Ely lasted for months, but eventually the Normans bribed the monastery priests to reveal the secret passages. Norman forces entered Ely, killing most of the rebels. The fate of Hereward is uncertain. Some say he escaped the Normans and was never seen again. Others believe he was captured and killed. But one thing is certain: Hereward's name became one of the greatest symbols of Norman resistance. William had crushed these rebellions, but he knew that much harsher measures were needed to keep the Anglo-Saxon people in check. This is where the infamous harrying of the North comes into play. William decided to lay waste to the north of England to permanently crush the Anglo-Saxon uprisings. But my son, this horrific event deserves a story of its own, and I will tell it to you another time. But remember this: conquest is not just about winning a battle. True conquest is about capturing the soul of the people, and the Anglo-Saxons would not make it easy for William to win this war. Ah, my son, to conquer a kingdom is the work of swords, but to govern it is the work of minds and laws. William knew that the victory at Hastings had offered him the throne of England, but a throne alone was not enough. How would he rule these new lands? Before the Norman Conquest, Anglo-Saxon England had a form of feudal system, but it was vastly different from the rigid systematic feudalism brought by the Normans. William's goal was clear: to control the land, secure loyalty, and neutralize the Anglo-Saxon nobles. In doing so, the Norman rule would become permanent, and so the birth of the feudal order and the shaping of England began. My son, before the Norman Conquest, Anglo-Saxon nobles held large estates and were directly loyal to the king. But with William's arrival, this structure would be completely upended. William declared that all the land in England belonged to him. Imagine that, a king declaring that every inch of a country's land was his. This was one of the most significant signs of England's entry into Norman rule. William seized the lands of the Anglo-Saxons and distributed them among his loyal Norman knights and lords. These new landholders were Norman nobles, but no land was truly the property of just one lord. At the top was the king, and beneath him were lords, barons, who owed their allegiance to him. These lords, in turn, rented land to knights, expecting military service and loyalty in return. At the very bottom were the peasants, working the land, paying taxes, but with no rights of their own. This new system ensured that the Normans maintained control. Land could only be transferred with the king's permission, making William's authority unshakable. My son, the Normans knew that laws alone wouldn't be enough to consolidate their control. To demonstrate their power and subdue the people, they needed to build castles.
The first castles built were known as motte and bailey structures. Simple yet effective. The motte was a high mound with a wooden tower built on top, while the bailey was an enclosed settlement surrounded by defensive walls. These castles could be built quickly and were perfect for quelling uprisings. Each one served as a seal of Norman dominance. But William knew that wooden castles would not suffice for a lasting rule. For permanent control, stone castles were needed. And so, the great stone fortresses of the Normans began to rise across England.
The most famous of these, the Tower of London. Built in the heart of London, this massive fortress was not just a defense structure, it was also a symbol of Norman power and authority. When the Anglo-Saxons saw this enormous stone building, they understood that Norman rule was here to stay. William wanted to carve his conquest into the very stones of England. My son, a king who does not know what he possesses cannot govern his kingdom. When William conquered England, he wanted to know how much tax he could collect, who owned what land, and what resources were available. And so in 1086, he issued a great survey. This survey became known as the Domesday Book. William's men traveled to every village in England, recording the names of landowners, the size of their estates, the number of animals, mills, and farms. This was the most comprehensive data collection ever done in England.
This record allowed William to organize the tax system. Now questions like who should pay how much tax, which lord owned which land, and how many men each landholder had could be found in a single book.
For the people, however, this book was a burden. Because of the Domesday Book, there was no escape. The ownership of land and the taxes owed were all recorded, leaving no room for deception. Through this book, William further solidified his control over England. No landowner could act independently of the king. Why was the Domesday Book called the Book of Judgment Day? Because people believed these records would never change and would remain valid until the end of time. This book was one of the greatest proofs that William had firmly established Norman law over England. My son, the Norman Conquest was not just a military victory, it was a cultural and administrative revolution. The feudal system allowed the Normans to govern England through a loyal hierarchy. Castles became the physical symbols of Norman dominance, forever altering the landscape of England. The Domesday Book redefined the tax system and land ownership, further solidifying Norman rule. William was not only a conqueror, but also a ruler and lawgiver. The system he introduced would shape England's political structure for centuries. But my son, this was only the beginning. For after William's death, a new struggle for the throne would begin in England, and even the Normans would find themselves fighting amongst themselves. But that, my son, is a tale for another day. Now go, forget not what you have heard, and keep the lessons whispered by history in your heart. Ah, son, a kingdom isn't ruled by the sword alone. Faith, laws, and order are also what reinforce a ruler's authority. When William took the throne of England, he didn't just conquer lands and people, he knew he had to conquer the Holy Church as well. The Anglo-Saxon priests and bishops had been shaping the faith and loyalty of the people for centuries. If he couldn't control this power, his kingdom could crumble at any moment. That's why, after the Norman Conquest, a major reform began within the Church of England. The Normans didn't just build cathedrals and monasteries. They completely changed the structure, leadership, and operation of the church. Son, there was a man at the head of the Anglo-Saxon Church, Stigand, the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was the highest-ranking member of the church in England. But for William, Stigand was a huge problem. Why, you ask? Because Stigand had strong ties with both the Anglo-Saxon kings and Queen Edith. In fact, even the Pope in Rome had declared that he wasn't fit for the archbishopric. William wanted the church to be fully loyal to him in order to secure his throne. But Stigand was an independent power, and he posed a threat to Norman rule. After the conquest of 2066, William didn't even want Stigand to wear the royal crown during the coronation. Instead of him, another bishop supported by the Pope conducted the ceremony. This was the first sign that Stigand's power was beginning to fade. But William wouldn't settle for just a symbolic change. In 1070, with the Pope's backing, Stigand was removed from office. The former archbishop was imprisoned, and the Normans replaced him with their own men at the head of the church. Thus, the leadership of the Church of England was taken from the Anglo-Saxons and placed under Norman control. Stigand's fall was just the beginning, son. William wanted to fully bring the Church of England under his authority. To do this, he removed Anglo-Saxon bishops one by one and replaced them with men from the Norman clergy. One of the most notable appointments was Lanfranc, who replaced Anselm as Archbishop of Canterbury. This man was a staunch supporter of the Norman order and worked to implement William's reforms. With the Norman reforms, the church now had its own courts. In Anglo-Saxon times, religious crimes were often judged by the king's judges. But William gave the church its own judicial power, ensuring the clergy would be judged within their own ranks. This not only allowed the Normans to establish complete control over the church, but also fundamentally changed the balance of power between the church and the state. William and his Norman rulers had massive cathedrals and monasteries built throughout England. These weren't just places of worship, but symbols of Norman power. The wooden Anglo-Saxon churches were replaced by the Normans' massive stone structures.
With these reforms, the Church of England became an instrument of Norman rule. Now, every bishop, priest, and monk was loyal to William and his dynasty.
Son, another way to rule a country is to change its laws. The Normans didn't completely eliminate the Anglo-Saxon laws, but they blended their own legal system with these old traditions. Norman law was harsher and more centralized than the Anglo-Saxon system. William ensured that the law was applied in a way that strengthened the king's authority. With the Normans, royal-appointed judges emerged. In the past, local communities would judge criminals within their own ranks, but now decisions were made by Norman judges. This new system meant that the people had to answer directly to the king. William now controlled not only the landowners, but also the common people. Norman laws were far harsher than the Anglo-Saxon justice system. For example, the Normans abolished the Anglo-Saxon were-guild system. In the past, when someone was killed, their family would receive a payment to settle the matter. But the Normans made murder a royal matter and often enforced the death penalty. They also introduced new rules like the forest laws. The Anglo-Saxon people saw hunting as a natural right, but the Normans prohibited hunting and allowed only Norman nobles to hunt. This led to widespread anger among the common people against Norman rule. The outcome, the impact of the Norman reforms on England. Son, the Norman reforms changed England not only physically but also legally and religiously. The church was taken from the Anglo-Saxons and began to be governed by the Normans. The fall of Stigand and the appointment of Norman bishops led to religious authority falling under the king's control. Laws were radically changed. The Anglo-Saxon justice system was replaced by a more centralized, harsher legal system unique to the Normans. Royal power was strengthened. Now, William was the master not just of the lands, but of the laws and the faith as well. These reforms were a turning point in England's history. And remember, son, This new order would be further developed by the kings who came after the Normans, shaping the way England was ruled for centuries. Now, don't forget what you've heard, and keep the lessons whispered by history in your mind. Because the fate of a kingdom is written not only on battlefields but also in courts and churches. Ah, son, the Norman Conquest didn't just change England, it also tied England's fate to France's in a way that couldn't be undone. From that point on, these two nations' paths would be built on rivalry, betrayal, and war, not friendship. And the foundations of this story were laid during William's reign. Normandy's son was a region that Vikings had conquered in the 10th century. Over time, however, the Vikings blended with the Franks, converted to Christianity, and became part of the kingdom of Francia. The Normans were warriors, brave, and knew how to seize opportunities. Before William became King of England, he was Duke of Normandy, so when he rose to the throne, he ruled not just England but Normandy as well. But here's the big problem. Normandy was still under the French king's rule. William was an independent king in England, but in France, as the Duke of Normandy, he was a vassal to the French king, the Capetian dynasty. This created a huge contradiction. On one hand, he was an absolute ruler in England, but on the other, he was a vassal to another king in Normandy. This situation would lead to endless conflict between England and France for the next centuries. English kings would have to fight repeatedly to protect their claims to French lands. After the Norman Conquest, many of the English nobles were of French descent. These people owned land in England and had family ties in France. So many Norman lords became part of a class that had one foot in England and the other in France. Because of this, every decision made in England also impacted French politics. English kings had to constantly look after their interests in France, which dragged England into the internal struggles of France. One of William's biggest enemies was French King Philip I. Philip didn't want Normandy to break away from France and saw William's rise to the English throne as a threat. So the French king stirred up rebellious nobles in Normandy against William. Meanwhile, William was trying to rule England and defend his lands in France. William and the kings that followed him would have to govern England while defending their lands in France. This would be a heavy burden for the English monarchy, and this burden lit the fire for the throne struggles between William's sons after his death. At his peak, William was a warrior, but time shows no mercy, son. He was worn out from constantly going back and forth between Normandy and England, fighting all the time. In 1087, while at war with French King Philip I, he was severely wounded. His weakened body couldn't hold up anymore. William passed away at a monastery in Rouen. But his death wasn't just the passing of a king. It was a moment that would change the future of an empire. He left behind a massive battle for the throne. When William died, his two sons fought for the throne. His eldest son, Robert Curthose, wanted Normandy. His second son, William Rufus, wanted to take England. Before he died, William had left Normandy to his eldest son and England to his youngest. But this meant that England and Normandy wouldn't stay united as one kingdom. And so, the brothers went to war to destroy each other. Robert claimed rights over England as the ruler of Normandy. William Rufus, on the other hand, worked to solidify his power in England by gaining the support of the nobles. This internal conflict weakened Norman rule and threw England into chaos, but in the end, William Rufus came out on top and claimed the English throne.
However, William Rufus wasn't as powerful a ruler as his father. He wasn't well liked by the people, ruling with a harsh and ruthless style.
To gain the support of the Norman nobles, he imposed heavy taxes. He tried to weaken the church's power, which led to constant conflicts with the clergy. He spent heavily on wars to protect his lands in France.
William Rufus's reign started weakening Norman power. This led to widespread discontent in England. The nobles began to unite against him and revolts broke out. And so, son, the order brought by the Norman Conquest began to crumble with William's death. England was now divided, teetering on the brink of chaos. With William's death, the struggle between England and France entered a new phase. The Norman kings would have to keep fighting to control both England and their lands in France. And this was the beginning of the endless conflict between England and France that would continue for centuries. These two great kingdoms would battle for centuries, with kings rising and falling. But son, history has taught us one thing. Great victories aren't only won with a sword. Sometimes the greatest battle is the one fought for the throne. And the story of the Normans was far from over. Son! After King William Rufus's death, England once again fell into uncertainty. But as fate would have it, even in the toughest times, a strong leader emerges. And that leader was William's youngest son, Henry I. When Henry ascended the throne in 1100, the Norman order was in danger. It was a time when royal authority was weakening, and Henry rolled up his sleeves to strengthen central governance and restore discipline to England. After William Rufus's sudden death, the throne of England was left vacant. The natural heir, Robert Curthos, was in Normandy and wasn't ready to rule England. Henry saw this as an opportunity and quickly crowned himself King of England in Westminster. However, this rise to the throne wasn't fully accepted. There was unrest among the nobles. Robert Curthos in Normandy believed he should be king and was preparing to challenge Henry's rule. Robert mounted an expedition to England to overthrow Henry, but in 1106, Henry defeated Robert in the Battle of Tinchebray and captured him. Thus, Normandy was once again united with the Kingdom of England. Now, Henry was not just the ruler of England, but of Normandy as well. But ruling wasn't just about winning battles. He needed reforms to establish a strong central authority in England. Henry made his father William's feudal system stricter and expanded royal courts to increase control over the people. Now, judges loyal to the king were responsible for dispensing justice across the country. This made it harder for the feudal lords to run their own courts and strengthen the central government. Justice was no longer in the hands of the nobles but depended on the king's will. Henry reformed the tax system and made the royal treasury more efficient. By establishing the royal treasury in Winchester, he began managing the country's finances better. Now, the kingdom could gather more funds for wars and strengthen its army. Henry also walked a fine line in his relationship with the church. In medieval Europe, kings and popes were in constant conflict. Henry wanted to reduce the power of the church and have the final say in bishop appointments. But Pope Paschal II argued that this authority was solely the church's. This conflict evolved into the investiture controversy, a major power struggle. But Henry managed to strike a compromise that pleased both the church and preserved his own authority. In 1107, he recognized the church's spiritual leadership while also maintaining royal authority in secular matters. Henry passed strict laws to curb the power of barons. Feudal lords were the biggest threat to Henry's central authority. They could maintain their own armies, collect taxes from the people, and run their own local justice systems. To ensure their loyalty, Henry closely monitored the lands of the feudal lords. He also imposed harsh punishments on those who were disloyal to the king. But, son, just like any powerful king's fate, Henry too eventually found himself without an heir. And that threw England into chaos for many years. Henry was a strong king, but he had a major misfortune. His son, William Adelin, drowned in a shipwreck in 1120. With that, the natural heir to the throne was gone. This was a huge disaster for England because a kingdom without an heir would inevitably turn into a battlefield. Henry's only surviving child was Matilda, but in the Middle Ages, it was nearly impossible for a woman to take the throne. The English barons didn't want to accept Matilda's rule. Henry declared Matilda his heir, but after his death, great chaos ensued in England. After Henry's death, Matilda's cousin Stephen seized the throne. The barons supported Stephen because they didn't want a strong female ruler. But Matilda didn't bow down, and she went to war to claim her rightful place. This war led to a huge civil war in England. This period, known as anarchy, turned England into a battleground for 20 years. The rise of feudal lords and the shaking of the Norman order. During the Civil War, royal authority collapsed and feudal lords began to act independently in their territories. Nobles began supporting their own armies. Local castles were built, and barons ignored the king's orders. The war between Matilda and Stephen split England in two. Some regions supported Matilda, while others backed Stephen. But after many years of fighting, both sides were weakened. In the end, in 1153, a peace agreement was reached. Eventually, Stephen accepted Matilda's son, Henry Plantagenet, as his heir, and in 1154, when Stephen died, Henry II became the new king of England. This son marked the beginning of the Plantagenet dynasty. The Norman order had been shaken and England had emerged from a great civil war, but a new dynasty would restore England to a strong kingdom once again. But that is another story. Ah, my child. The Norman Conquest, one of the great turning points in history, wasn't just about a war or the rise of a king. It was an event that fundamentally changed England's identity, governance, and culture. And those changes would be felt for centuries to come. Now, close your eyes and imagine. This island, once ruled by the Anglo-Saxons, was now being shaped under the iron grip of the Normans. King William and his descendants didn't just rule, they steered England's future in a completely new direction. Before the Norman Conquest, England was semi-centralized, with Anglo-Saxon nobles holding significant power. The kings were strong, but local lords and royal advisors had a say too. But William couldn't accept this kind of governance. He wanted to establish a strict feudal system, just like the one in Normandy, France. So he almost completely wiped out the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy and replaced them with Norman nobles. Now, the king wasn't just a figurehead. He was the embodiment of absolute power. William and his heirs developed new laws and systems to directly manage every corner of the kingdom. With the Normans' arrival, major changes were made to the legal system. Under the Anglo-Saxons, local courts and traditional law ruled. But the Normans, influenced by French and feudal law, restructured the system. William created the Domesday Book to keep track of the land and people in the country. It wasn't just a tax register, it was a symbol of royal power and control. The Norman Conquest transformed England from being an English kingdom to more of a major Norman French state in Europe. Because William and his descendants didn't just rule England, they also had to manage Normandy in France. This would become one of the key factors that shaped England's internal and external politics for centuries. The Norman kings were constantly at war with France, fighting to protect their lands. These conflicts laid the foundation for the Anglo-French rivalry that would last for centuries. Ah, language. It's one of the most powerful forces in determining a people's identity. After the Normans arrived, English was pushed to the side and French became the language of the aristocracy and ruling class. Law, literature, and court language were all in French. The English people kept speaking their own language, but over time the two languages blended and the foundations of modern English were formed. Did you know, my child, that many of the words we use in English today come from Norman French? Words like government, court, judge, and royal, they're all part of the Norman legacy. With the Normans' arrival, most of the English aristocracy was either killed or had their land taken away. In their place, Norman nobles were brought in, creating an entirely new elite class in English society. But over time, even these Norman nobles began to change. The Norman generations born in England started adopting Anglo-Saxon traditions and blending with the English identity. Thus, a completely new class was born, the Anglo-Normans. Not fully Norman, not fully English, these people became the masters of the New England. The Normans didn't just change the government, they also radically transformed England's architecture. They built massive stone castles. The Tower of London was one such creation from this period. Norman Romanesque churches and cathedrals rose up. The old wooden Anglo-Saxon churches were replaced with large, grand stone buildings. These architectural changes symbolized the power and permanence of the Normans in England. And so, my child, the effects of the Norman Conquest didn't just begin in 1066. This great transformation turned into a legacy that shaped England's identity for centuries. The Normans didn't just conquer a people, they rebuilt a nation. Today, if you look at modern England, you can see the Normans' legacy everywhere, in its language, legal system, its courts, and even in the royal family itself. That's why the Norman Conquest wasn't just a battle, it was the transformation of an era. One of the biggest turning points that shaped England. But remember, my child, history never stands still. Even after the Normans left, England continued to change, grow, and write new stories. And now, we're the ones who will keep telling those stories.